Welcome, Minnie. So great to speak to you and get to know you. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you like to invest in and the firm that you work for?
Sure, absolutely. Well, my name is Minnie, and I'm a partner at TenOneTen, and TenOneTen is a early stage fund here in Los Angeles, and we like to lead seed stage rounds and get really involved with the founders that we're backing and help them get to the next milestones in their journey. We mostly do B2B software investing, and that manifests a lot in sort of automation and efficiency for legacy businesses, but always looking for whatever is next and cool.
And LA is sort of booming in the last few years, really, as regards startups and investors. And I know even some Silicon Valley investors went down to LA. So, how is the scene down there? Is it pretty much booming, particularly now since the crisis?
Yeah, I would say that's a fair characterization. I think when my friends ask what sort of startup to join, that sort of thing, I always say,
Yeah.
joining one that's got a lot of momentum and just the growth makes, sort of the rising tide lift all boats. And I would say LA as a
Right.
market really has that feel to it. It feels like a fast
Fabulous.
growing ecosystem, which is exciting.
Yeah.
The only sort of interesting caveat, perhaps, to what you said is it does seem like a lot of investors are moving down. And in some ways, LA and San Francisco or LA and the Bay Area sort of feel like they're becoming one market.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. The only reason I have like a question mark around that was that I did promote an investor led events in Silicon Valley. I organised a whole lot of venture capitalists to come to an event for this electric car. And I found that they had no idea, the investors that employed me, I had no idea about the culture in Silicon Valley. And I sort of had to educate them. And I thought, gee, we're so close to LA, and you would think that it's sort of similar. And this was a few years ago, obviously, I think 2018. So, maybe things have changed. But I was sort of shocked that they seem to have no idea. Now, it may have just been that particular investment firm. They weren't venture capitalists, so I don't know. So that was why I questioned it.
No, I don't think you're alone at all. So I do this weekly podcast where I interview a different Los Angeles based VC on my podcast, and
Ah,
everyone has told me, "Oh, you're going to run out of LA VCs." And I've been doing it over 2 years and have done something like 150 different partners at different VC funds here in LA, and that always surprises people.
wow. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's really good news, and fantastic to hear your perspective. And what do you particularly like to invest in? Like, what's your main focus? And do you want to talk more about some of your portfolio companies?
Sure, I on the one hand, I invest in great people, and that's really the motivating factor, which is um, most of my career has actually been running my own startup and then being very early at Google. And a lot of what I did in those roles was actually essentially recruiting.
Right.
um, Essentially, what I did with at least a third of my time was just interviewing people,
Okay.
and so I take some of that same approach when I'm doing venture capital. Is I do what I know, right? Which is I interview people and uh, and I'm not, when you're a founder, you're quite heads down. And so
Yes.
transitioning from being a founder to being a VC, I feel like a lot of VCs are sort of smarter about these developed theses. They've really had their heads up and looking how different markets evolve. And I feel like I'm at least qualified to interview people. So that's always a starting point for me. um,
And it almost is it's so compelling when you're good at interviewing. I would say that's what I've noticed. That some people then think just in ordinary conversation that you're interviewing them, and I'm like, oh no, I'm just talking to you.
right, right. No, I mean, I've learned a lot about interviewing and, idle questions. I mean, and getting people off their talk track, but without asking them questions that you're not really interested in the answer to. And uh,
Yeah.
all of that.
Fantastic. Oh well, hopefully, I'll put the link in the transcript for your podcast, and hopefully people can tune into that podcast as well. It sounds great. And I was wondering, I noted that obviously you're a female VC, and I noted that you're raising kids. How is that? Just to give you a little bit of my background, I when I first went to Silicon Valley, I spent a year after failing to raise venture in Europe. I spent a year video interviewing VCs in Silicon Valley and women founders on why women are funded less than men. And in those days, of course, it was less than 2%. And I think, these days it's just a bit over 2%, but at least I was one of the voices that was raising awareness of the challenges for women and also for female VCs. That's changed a lot. There's a lot of female VCs, but it is hard to manage raising a family and also having a high profile job like yours as a female venture capitalist. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So many different dimensions. So first off, I completely agree that it has changed in the past, let's call it 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Not just the numbers, but actually the tenor of people being deliberately trying to support each other or support women or other minorities. I mean, it's just night and day different. But the way I sort of think about that is, I mean, it sort of comes back to diversity and inclusion, which is really thinking about the inclusion side of things. And so I think about it as not just how do we encourage women to, raise their hand to have a seat at the table, but how do decisions get made, whether that's how we decide how to allocate money as investors, or even at Google or at large companies, how do resources get allocated? And I think that if the way that those decisions get made is because someone is pounding the table and speaking confidently about their 5-year projections, and we're not actually leaving room for people who maybe have a different approach to raising capital or asking for resources, I think that's the challenge that we need to face, is thinking about sort of decision making as a society and making sure that we have room for whether it's women or others, who might just have a sort of a different operating mode than kind of the traditional, older white man at the table in the VC rooms. Um, but to me specifically, uh, first off, my husband hasn't worked now since we had our first child, who's maybe he hasn't worked in 9 years now. Um, and that is, I don't think I would be able to have the career that I know I wouldn't be able to have the career I've had and feel good about the way that my children are being raised if I didn't have someone else at home who I had complete faith in was really taking care of my children. I also live with my parents. So, I know that a lot of the reason I'm able to do what I'm doing, because I work a lot,
Yeah.
and I like working a lot. I feel very lucky. I feel much easier for me to go to work on Monday than if I were to stay home. I find that harder, actually, a harder job. But a lot of that is because my husband is home with the children.
And so nice that you've sort of got extended family as well with your parents. I mean, it just becomes like, what do they say? It takes a village to raise a child.
Yeah.
And that doesn't often happen in the West. It happens a lot more in ethnic societies, but definitely not so much in the West. I was a single mother, raised 3 children by myself after my marriage went. So I know the juggle of trying to work in my own business as well as raise the children. So it's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me how it's been since the crisis. What have you noted? I've spoken to a few investors, and I know at the beginning of the crisis everyone was just big question marks, but now it seems like investments are really hot and the market's really heated up. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I was still thinking about children. I mean, I had all of
Oh,
my children.
okay.
No, I was just still thinking about. I mean, I had all 3 of my children essentially while I was building my startup. So I mean, it was crazy, crazy times.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So where we are
Intense.
now, um, Well, I mean, different places where we are. So on the one hand, I think a lot of the conversation right now is around, are we in a bubble with valuations? Because as you say,
Mm,
everything has heated up.
mm.
Uh, Companies in my portfolio, we have 85 companies in our portfolio now. And, companies that I might have said, oh, you're a little early to go raise your Series A. I said this recently, and the company just raised from Tiger at 125 post. And I thought they were maybe a little early to go out and raise their, Series A
Yeah.
at a 50, 60 million post. So clearly I was miscalibrated on that.
Mm,
Um, but, people ask, so are we in a bubble? And I guess, I mean, obviously I don't know, but there aren't any signs that things are slowing down other than everyone's asking, are we in a bubble? There aren't signs like portfolio companies struggling to raise money, or people struggling to raise more venture capital dollars, or family offices getting interested in the asset class. So there aren't those signs. Now that isn't to say that things might not pop, but they're not going to sort of, doesn't look like things are gradually cooling by any stretch. um, I also think that the other piece of this is our country's and our world's approach to entrepreneurship has changed, and I think is going to continue to change,
mm,
so that in some sense the supply of entrepreneurs is only growing, and so it can actually support a quite robust uh, venture ecosystem and almost just new approach to employment. So it's
mm,
not just that more people are starting startups, but it's that fewer and fewer people are having careers in one profession, and they're without a side hustle of some sort. You and I both have podcasts, for example. I mean, that's
mm,
entrepreneurship, right? And
mm,
I think we're just seeing that the tools that are available and the societal norms and a variety of different factors are coming together to enable everyone to to have, whether it's a side hustle or a side hustle that becomes a startup, or a new business. And I think people are just, that career path has been de-risked. You don't have to do a startup and therefore live off ramen or that sort of thing. There's less stigma. So anyways, the whole ecosystem is interconnected, and has remained, what I everything I see is still extremely strong.
right. And that, particularly during the crisis, so like in the last year and a half or so, have you noticed any differences or
Yeah, I
than
mean,
before?
a lot of that has really um, uh, exacerbated or accelerated during the
Okay.
crisis, which is the valuations. Um, a lot of that has only accelerated, and I don't really think the crisis has almost not been the key factor. I think in a lot of that, I think it's actually been more probably seeing the crossover investors, as in traditionally public market investors entering the private markets more and more. um, and what we just saw with Sequoia, which is private market investors bleeding into the public markets. And so that merging of the worlds has led to more money in the private markets.
Right. And it also, with so much remote work, I gather, and some investors have mentioned this, that, it used to be quite parochial, where VCs wanted to invest where they were based, and now almost like that's not happening anymore, or can't happen anymore, with the world going virtual. So, do you have any perspectives on that at all?
Yeah, I think that's true, which is now we're, getting much more comfortable in investing and meeting people over Zoom. I also think that when I was first starting my entrepreneurial journey, or just even early at Google, it was more of a black box. And so actually entrepreneurs more felt the need to go, join an accelerator or move to the Bay Area to rub elbows with other founders or other investors. And now, universities all over the world and other, non-university institutions are teaching entrepreneurship. It's been demystified in a really accessible way. So it's not just that the VC dollars, the investors can invest other places. It's that entrepreneurs are being born in other locations. Um, and I have one caveat to that a little bit.
Yep.
Well, I said that I'm mostly a B2B investor. Uh, I think in certain fields, it's easier to grow ecosystems. And what I would say is, if you're building a company that is selling into the enterprise, the muscle of a product manager who's built product for enterprise and understands, enterprise security and enterprise uh, authentication and all of those concerns is different. Similarly with the enterprise sales, that muscle is harder to come without experience. And so I think when LA got started, it was a lot more on things like mobile apps. Like Snap is sort of the classic example that where from LA a decade ago. And so what you saw, I think, is some of the areas that LA started in. Were ones that were sort of easier to get going without that plethora of experience. But now, with decades later of experience, I think we now have those people who have that muscle of doing more sort of later stage and sort of more enterprise focused company building.
That's a really good insight. And I have to ask this question because you're based in LA. How is the supply chain crisis or the global shipping crisis affected startups? Is there a whole lot of new innovation starting to pop up around these issues that have occurred over the last year and a half?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think that, as you may know, like the Southern California, Los Angeles has the largest port in the United States, as well as the second largest port in the United States. It's the largest manufacturing city in the United States. And so there's so very much affected by this global crisis. And kind of like what you alluded to with our COVID crisis, crises are sort of good for entrepreneurship because
Yeah.
eh, everyone then is looking for new and innovative solutions. And
Yeah.
so I have an investment in a company called Vendor Flow. Vendor
Okay.
Flow is a communications layer for the transportation industry. And it's sort of shocking, but even in today's day and age, the, let's say, freight brokers communicating with freight carriers, they send email, they use WhatsApp, they send SMS, but it is not efficient. And so you might email someone and say, can do you have a truck available to go from point A to point B, and it needs to have refrigeration? And the person might reply back, I don't have a refrigeration truck. And then 4 months later, you don't have a CRM system set up. You don't have that communication sort of layered in with your CRM system, and so you reply back again. 4 months later, hey, do you have a refrigeration truck? And the answer is again no. And so there's a lot in that sort of global supply chain. I'm just using vendor flow as one example where
Yeah.
things can get more efficient, can have technology that enables enables or fixes a lot of the things that are broken.
Right. Minnie, just to finish off, what's your takeaway from what we've all gone through in the last year and a half? It's just the elephant in the room, so we have to finish with that piece. What's your takeaway out of the crisis?
uh, Many different things. On the one hand, we've shook up a lot, and some of those pieces are going to land very differently at the end, hopefully, of this crisis, and some of that will be positive, and obviously some will be a challenge for a lot of people and children. But some things like the assumption that we all had to travel and go into the office and meet people face to face. A lot of those have a lot of positive things. Very positive on medicine and just amazing things coming out of really sort of the intersection of technology and health and medicine. And really being able to apply artificial intelligence to the way we do things like genomics or proteins. And then so very positive on sort of the opportunities there. And I think I think the just general crisis in America is around the bottom half of society sort of being left behind, and I think the crisis has accentuated that in negative ways. And so, but that's not really just the crisis. That's sort of the state of the world that we're in right now. And so, if anything, hopefully it's even more of a wake up call on what we need to do to make sure that, we're not leaving people behind, and, children aren't at home without access to um, the learning and the technology and the resources that the top half of society has.
And of course, at the same time that COVID crisis hit, the climate change crisis seemed to heat up and intensify. Although, I'm quite old and I've been focused on that since my 20s. So, but it seems like everyone now has to pay attention to that. Has that also impacted in the sense of their startups coming in with innovation around climate change and carbon?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think
Right.
maybe a decade ago, there was maybe even more than that, decade ago, when a lot of Silicon Valley funds made bets on clean tech. Now we call it
Yeah.
climate tech.
Yeah.
We've changed the terms. But I think that 10 years ago, like, there was a need to invest in projects that were infrastructure projects. There were hundreds of millions of dollars. And now there's still that mandate, that need, but there's also a lot that those infrastructure projects have matured. We have huge solar farms and wind, and so now there's also a lot of startups that might be more in sort of the wheelhouse of something that my fund could do, which are software projects that are
Mm.
less capital intensive projects that are, artificial intelligence applied to grid optimization or to
Right.
battery testing, or different things that aren't a $500 million build out. And so that's exciting, which is,
Yeah.
there's a lot that different funds can do.
Fantastic. Look, absolutely interesting and delightful to talk with you, Minnie, today. And I'll definitely, hopefully, include your link to your podcast so people can um, tune into your podcast as well. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pema. Great to chat with you.